We've been poring over dozens of updates for PS5 Pro since launch, but one of the games that really caught my attention and got me back into playing it again is Stellar Blade. This beautiful action-adventure impressed me when it released earlier this year with its combination of slick action, gorgeous locales, and a fantastic soundtrack. But it has some issues as well, specifically regarding image quality and performance. Which is why I was curious to see what the PS5 Pro patch could really bring to the table. And the result? Something that's both very simple yet very effective. It's what I would call a basic upgrade, but one that you'll want to use. The developer has essentially implemented 2 new graphics modes specifically for PS5 Pro, leveraging PSSR and the increased horsepower to refine what was already a great game. So how does it fare, and are there any issues with PSSR in this title? Let's find out. So for starters, unlike many patches thus far, Stellar Blade leaves the original 3 modes fully intact. That is, the performance, balance, and quality modes are all still available, and they work exactly as they did on PS5, though albeit with less fluctuation in terms of dynamic resolution scaling. Each of these options is limited to just 60 Hz output, and they use different types of anti-aliasing based on which one is selected. When played on a PS5 Pro, 2 additional modes are available, known as Pro and Pro Max. No, it's not an iPhone reference, but these new modes are worth examining all the same. Pro Max essentially takes the original game's quality mode and removes the 30 FPS cap, allowing the game to run at higher frame rates. When coupled with VRR, it's rather convincing and significantly better than what I would describe as a useless 30 FPS mode. The Pro option, however, utilizes PSSR instead, and this is where we see the largest boost in terms of actual image quality. It's more temporally stable, edges are cleaner, yet it's still reasonably sharp. It just produces a more pleasing image that better handles fine details that you'll see throughout the game. So using this scene here where this spinning blade sort of uncovers the raw pixels, I was able to pixel count all the various modes and get an idea of where they stand. In this scene, both the performance and the balanced modes come in around 1440p, while the quality mode is native 4K, as is the Pro Max. The normal Pro mode using PSSR, however, comes in at 1800p, which is higher than the performance and balanced mode of the original release. With this established then, let's take a look at some additional scenarios and modes to better understand how PSSR impacts overall picture quality. After all, as we've now learned, PSSR is not a magic bullet, and there are numerous games exhibiting issues with PSSR implemented. So on the face of it, under normal scenarios, the differences we've seen thus far hold true. PSSR produces a very temporally stable image without any of the pixel crawl that we see in other TAA modes in this game. Now, the original balanced mode fares somewhat better, as I noted in my original video on the game, but it still tends to appear blurrier than the PSSR mode and can exhibit artifacts where PSSR does not. Just standing still and looking closely at the scenery around you reveals the massive boost in temporal stability. Edges and surfaces alike are cleaner and more stable than before. Even the native resolution options produce results that I would argue aren't especially great as a result of severe pixel shimmering. Look at the sign in this scene, for instance. It's a garbled mess here in the performance mode, but very clean with PSSR, don't you think? Now, I mostly compared performance, balanced, and pro modes for this reason, as these 3 show the most differences, but I also wanted to share some situations where perhaps the image quality struggles a bit due to specific things happening in each scene. Even in the options menu, for instance, you can see a massive difference in image quality here between performance and pro mode. Eve's hair is an absolute mess in the original performance mode, and there's tons of shimmering and artifacts here. But I found some other interesting scenarios as well. So check this out. Standing beneath this tarp, we can see how each of these 3 modes handles transparency, since it directly interferes with the image production. All 3 exhibit ghosting of some sort, but the presentation of said ghosting is pretty different. Let me draw your eye to the text here on this panel. With PSSR, you can still barely make out the word upgrade. With the other modes, however, the artifacts become too strong and the detail is not especially visible. Here's another scenario with a light flickering on and off. I noticed that in the balanced mode, this actually produced some additional fizzle when the light quickly transitions from dim to bright. TAA and PSSR, however, both present this rather differently and more cleanly, which I found interesting. On the flip side, PSSR introduces some minor flicker in spots where previously there was none. The sun, for instance, in balanced and performance mode, can observe a very slight intentional flicker. Yet in PSSR mode, the flicker is increased and extends to the components of the sun flare itself, which I don't think is intended behavior. So that's one strike against PSSR. Still, while there are certainly trade-offs to consider here, the overall image quality in Stellar Blade is excellent when using PSSR. Arguably the best example we've seen thus far, especially in light of all the games with issues. The high input resolution around 1800p certainly helps, no doubt, and the result is clean while being mostly devoid of artifacts. It helps that the original solutions were rather poor in the base game. While balanced mode was okay, this was ultimately the one real visual caveat I had with what is otherwise a beautiful game, and it's still beautiful here on PS5 Pro. But with that out of the way, this brings us to our next topic, the frame rate. You see, in the original game, only the performance mode, which has rather poor image quality, managed to deliver a locked 60 frames per second experience when played on an original PlayStation 5. If you recall, the resolution mode was capped to 30, and the balanced mode was not exactly completely stable. If you play this on a PS5 Pro now, both the balanced and performance modes lock to 60 frames per second, which you'd expect. Now, if you play this game on a normal 60Hz display, the new Pro mode with PSSR delivers the same experience in terms of performance. You get a near perfect 60 FPS experience, at least based on the areas I've tested for making this video. However, if you look beneath these new Pro options, you'll spot the toggle for the high frame rate mode. By enabling this, you unlock a 120Hz output option, and this has a couple of benefits. Firstly, frame rate aside, this mode reduces input lag, resulting in a more responsive experience. If you recall, this was kind of an issue when the game initially launched. It wasn't as responsive as it should have been. It seems like this has been improved with subsequent patches, but this 120Hz mode manages to improve it further. I found it easier to nail dodges and blocks in this mode, which is certainly welcome. It's not a night and day difference, mind you, but it definitely is something you can feel. But more importantly, this mode removes the frame rate cap, sort of. Alright, so when using the Pro Max mode, which, if you recall, is just the original resolution mode but without the 30 FPS frame rate limit, this now runs up to 60 FPS, but it does not hold 60 FPS. It's clearly intended to be used with a VRR display, as the frame rate typically ranges between 50 to 60 frames per second, which is similar to the balance mode on original hardware, I suppose. In my first impressions, I actually thought it was capped at 50 frames per second, but no, it really can go up to 60. If you look at the sky, for instance, it jumps up, but during most of the gameplay, it is below 60 FPS. If you really want native 4K, this is probably the way to go, but remember, this has visual issues that you don't get in the PSSR mode. Now, it's the Pro mode that I found most interesting. This one raises the frame rate cap to 80 frames per second instead of 60. I assume 80 was selected as this is the average ceiling, and going above this would produce a less stable result. In practice, this mode does manage to hit 80 FPS a good amount of the time, but it can also drop into the 70s when things get busy. It may not seem like a huge jump in terms of performance, but going from 60 to 80 FPS does genuinely feel pretty good. When coupled with the improved input response, it's become my favorite way to play the game. You have excellent image quality, smooth action, and it does feel noticeably better than the PS5 original version. There is only one caveat though. The game's cutscenes are all capped at 60 FPS, which I feel is an acceptable trade-off here. It's unclear if there's an issue with HFR and cutscenes, which we'll find out in the PC version I suppose, or if the load is such that they just couldn't achieve much beyond 60 in these scenes, so they capped it at 60 for consistency. Either way, that's basically what you can expect from performance in the new Pro modes. So what the heck do you choose then if you're playing this game on a PS5 Pro? Well, my recommendation is pretty simple here. You go with the Pro mode rather than Pro Max, and just stick with it, regardless of whether you're using the high frame rate option or not. It is, frankly, the best option in the game, producing the best image quality and the smoothest frame rates. Honestly, the other modes don't have any real utility at this point, if you ask me. It's a shame we couldn't take advantage of PSSR for anti-aliasing alone while still getting a native 4K output, as we see with the Pro Max mode. Perhaps this is not yet supported with PSSR, but the idea is that it would deliver something along the lines of DLAA. Though obviously, PSSR isn't going to be quite at that level just yet. But that's basically where we're at with Stellar Blade on the PS5 Pro, and I think it's important to highlight as this is a great example of PSSR done well, in addition to offering the enhanced performance. Given how many other games have exhibited issues when using PSSR thus far, Shift Up basically shows how it should be done. They made a great looking game that now looks and runs smoother than it did originally. And it's good timing as well because a new update for the game has dropped shortly after the Pro patch with some additional new features alongside a crossover between Stellar Blade and Nier Automata. The big new one here though for me has to be the addition of a photo mode at last. This was sorely missing in the original release, but now at any time you can hit R1 plus left on the D-pad to activate it. From here the usual assortment of options are available, allowing you to take some nice looking shots or create cool panning clips for use in video content, one of my favorite things to do when covering a game. Curiously, the photo mode actually runs at a frame rate lower than the game itself, regardless of the mode selected. Given that you can add lights to the scene and do all kinds of other crazy effects, it's not surprising that they decided to cap it. It's just an observation, really. Still, between this and support for the PS5 Pro, I think it's a great time to revisit Stellar Blade or play it for the first time if you've not touched it yet. It's certainly one of my favorite games this year, that's for sure, so I recommend taking it for a spin if it looks like something you'd enjoy, especially if you have a PS5 Pro. But that's going to do it for this video, so I hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you next time.